So today we're going to dive into one of the foundational concepts of psychology, classical conditioning. So have you ever heard a song and instantly it took you back to a memory or made you feel a certain way? Or maybe you felt nervousness walking into a dentist's office even before anything happens. Well, these are all examples of how our brain learns to associate one thing with another, often without us even realizing it. In this lecture, we're going to go over classical conditioning, including an introduction to Pavlov. I'm going to give you several examples of classical conditioning, and then we're going to talk about stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. There is a quiz at the end of this lecture, and some of the questions are application questions. So pay attention to how I break down classical conditioning, because then you're going to apply it when you get to some of the questions. In psychology, classical conditioning helps us understand how fears and phobias can develop and why certain things can trigger emotional reactions when there really shouldn't be a reaction at all. And it also helps us know how to treat people that have phobias. So let's explore this topic and we'll look over how simple pairings like a sound and a feeling can shape behavior, emotion, or even mental health. So if you remember from an earlier lecture, I talked a little bit about ethics and how some of the earlier experiments that were done would not be done or allowed to be done today. Well, this is one of the ones that's a little bit questionable. But before we get into the terms of classical conditioning, let's look at this famous study that started all of it. And this was done by Ivan Pavlov. He was a Russian physiologist. Pavlov was originally studying digestion in dogs, but he noticed something interesting happening, that the dogs began to salivate not just when they saw the food, but when they heard the footsteps of the lab assistant who brought them the food. And there's really no reason why dogs should salivate because they hear footsteps. So that was kind of interesting to him, and he started looking into that concept. So this led Pavlov to explore how animals and people associate one thing with another. So here's what he did. He rang a bell, which shouldn't mean anything to a dog, and then he gave the dogs the food right after ringing the bell. And he repeated this a bunch of times, and eventually the dogs began to salivate just from hearing the bell. So even when no food was given. And this showed that the dogs had learned to associate the bell with food, and that a neutral sound, a neutral meaning that it should have no meaning whatsoever, so a neutral sound could trigger a physical response. And this process where a neutral response or a neutral stimulus becomes linked to a natural response is what we call classical conditioning. And it helps us to explain all kinds of emotional reactions, habits, and even fears that people have. So let's break down the basic parts of classical conditioning. So in the first box here, you see the picture of the food and the dog. So the unconditioned stimulus. This is something that naturally causes a reaction. For example, food naturally can cause a dog to drool. No training is needed. In fact, I could put really good food in front of you and your mouth would start to salivate. So, unconditioned means no learning has happened. The stimulus is what you present to the person or the animal that will cause a reaction. So unconditioned stimulus, we have the food, and it causes the unconditioned response, which is the response, the dog starts to drool. So that's the first box there. We then pair that with a neutral stimulus, and a neutral stimulus is something that doesn't cause a reaction at first. For example, ringing a bell. Or if you have a cat, the can opener. The can opener should do nothing for a cat, but the cat will, if you've ever had a cat, it pairs the can opener to the opening of the can and them getting fed. So originally the neutral stimulus is the sound of the can opener, or in Pavlov's experiment, it was the ringing of the bell. The conditioned stimulus, this is after learning has happened. This is the neutral thing after it's been paired with the unconditioned stimulus. For example, hearing the bell with food a bunch of times, and now the bell makes the dog drool. So the bell is now the conditioned stimulus. So now I can ring the bell. It's now been a conditioned stimulus, and it causes a conditioned response. So the learned reaction to the bell is now drooling, even if there's no food. So we have unconditioned before learning, conditioned after. For me, the easiest way to break it down is the response is going to be some sort of behavior or feeling. So it could be getting butterflies in your stomach. It could be feeling nostalgic. It's going to be something like that. It's going to be the response. The stimulus is whatever you're presenting that causes that reaction. So once you kind of have that worked out, then you can say, okay, did this happen before learning? Then it'd be unconditioned, or after learning, which would be conditioned. So let's go over a couple more examples. So let's take a look at classical conditioning using a real life example. The dog who learns to wag his tail when he hears his owner's car pulling into the driveway. So at first, the sound of the car doesn't mean anything to a dog. It should not cause a dog to wag his tail. But over time, the dog learns to start to connect the sound with something exciting, seeing his owner come home. So here's how it works. The unconditioned stimulus, we're going to think, what makes the dog naturally happy? And in this case, it's the owner arriving home. So before there's been any learning, the owner comes home, and it causes the unconditioned response, which is joy. The dog wags his tail. He's happy to see his owner. So before any learning, unconditioned stimulus is the owner coming home. Unconditioned response is the dog wags his tail. So the neutral stimulus, that's what shouldn't cause any reaction at all before it's paired, is the sound of the car pulling in. So in the beginning, that does nothing, but it's paired, that the sound of the car is paired with then the owner opening the door. Do that enough times, and now the conditioned, after learning's happened, the conditioned stimulus is the sound of the car. So this becomes conditioned to mean something good to the dog. And then the conditioned response is the dog wags his tail when he hears the car, even before he sees his owner. And I'll tell you, my dog, whenever I empty the dishwasher, he gets super excited because he knows that that's the thing that I do as soon as I finish my day. And right before we go on he's over here, a WALK. I can't even say the word. So the dishwasher has become a conditioned stimulus for my dog. Okay, for this example, I brought my dog, Remy, to listen to the example. So, true life example. Remy loves to go for walks. In fact, I wish you could see him right now. I say that word and his head's doing the tilt up. Here we go again. He's all excited because he thinks that that's what we're going to do. You have to be careful with that word. So let's talk about classical conditioning using a real life example. Remy, who loves to go for strolls. I'll use a different word. So the excitement is natural. There was no training that needed to happen. When we go out for a walk, when we go for a stroll, he is very happy. But something interesting has happened. He now gets excited and spins around whenever I get close to where I keep his leash. So there's a hook there, and all I have to do is get in that region, and he starts to run in circles and wag his tail and get all excited. And nothing should really happen with me walking over to that region. There should be no response at all. So let's break this down. The unconditioned stimulus is going for a walk. When we go for a walk, the response is he is happy. Tails wagging, strutting, he's loving it. The neutral stimulus, a thing that didn't cause any reaction at first, was me walking over to where the hook is or the leash, anything in that region. When he was a puppy, nothing happened. There was no association. But after learning, so now we're talking conditioned, the conditioned stimulus is me walking over to that region or getting near that hook or touching the magical leash. The response, if I do those things, any of those things, is he gets all excited and starts running around from seeing me just get over in that region. And I'm sure if you think about it, there's lots of examples. I mean, not just with dogs, I mean, with people in your life. Classical conditioning happens all the time. Okay, let's do another example. I love riding my horse. The stimulus of just riding my horse brings me joy. So unconditioned stimulus is riding my horse. The unconditioned response is joy. No learning has happened. It's just something I like to do. The conditioned stimulus, what I've paired with riding my horse, is the smell of a barn. Now, the smell of a barn probably isn't that appealing to a lot of people, but to me, every time I walk in a barn, a horse barn, I feel happy and relaxed and joyful. So I now associate the smell of a barn with riding my horse. Unconditioned, riding the horse, no learning, joy. Once now that I've paired that, or I've learned that the smell of a barn means riding a horse, now the conditioned smell of a barn, my response, I am happy. So now that we understand how classical conditioning works, where a person or animal starts to associate one thing with another, let's look at two other important concepts: stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. And these help us understand how phobias can develop and how they can be treated. So let's start with stimulus generalization. So stimulus generalization, and if you think about generalization, meaning spreading out, generalizing, happens when someone responds to not just the original trigger, but things that are similar to it. So imagine somebody is bit by a large black dog. That experience is scary. Even if you're not afraid of dogs, it's scary. And it would be reasonable to start feeling anxious when they see that type of dog again. But over time, for some people, they may start feeling anxious around any dog, even smaller, friendly ones, different colored ones. The fear, the anxiety generalizes. So stimulation generalization is when the fear spreads from the one specific dog to all dogs because they share similar features. And this is really common with phobias, A person might have a bad experience in one situation, and then they start to react fearfully in similar situations, even if they are safe. So you could theoretically have somebody who started having reactions to just seeing a dog on TV or reading about a dog. I mean, it can generalize out beyond just the specific situation where it initially happened. Stimulus discrimination is when a person learns to respond to only a specific trigger and not all things that are similar. So this picture might make some of you uncomfortable. Fear of heights is a very common experience. So let's say that somebody has a fear of heights after a very scary experience, a high balcony fall. Let's just pretend. And at first, they start to feel anxious on any elevated surface. They could feel anxious like sitting on bleachers at a football game, looking out a second story window that is secure, but even looking out. But through therapy and repeated safe experiences, they could learn that not all heights are dangerous. So being afraid of heights, for example, standing like this picture, that's insane. That's dangerous, and you should be nervous because it's dangerous. But looking out a window, if let's say your office is on the 8th floor and looking out the window, that's not dangerous, and there really should not be any physiological response, any nervousness about that. So what we can do as therapists is help somebody learn to discriminate between, this dangerous situation and situations that really you're high up, but it's not dangerous. So eventually a person might feel less anxious if they're like at open ledges or if they're on balconies, looking out windows, like those types of things. And that is stimulus discrimination. Stimulus discrimination. When you learn to tell the difference between what is truly threatening and what is not. So as we wrap up our discussion on classical conditioning, it's important to remember that this type of learning is all around us, and it shapes how we respond to people, places, sounds, smells, and even emotions. So whether it's a dog wagging his tail at the sound of leash, or me saying the word walk, or someone feeling anxious when they hear thunder, classical conditioning helps us understand the associations between experiences and reactions, and it often happens without us even realizing it. So we've covered how a neutral stimulus can become meaningful through repeated pairing. We've talked about how emotional and behavioral responses can be learned and sometimes unlearned. We talked about stimulus generalization, stimulus discrimination, and how that can help explain why fears can be spread or they can become more specific. So understanding how classical conditioning gives us insight into our habits, our phobias, our preferences, emotional triggers, it can help you understand just how to have healthy patterns. So the next time you feel a sudden emotional reaction, could be the way somebody looks, it could be a smell, think about what have I paired this with, or why might I have learned this association? Because it's classical conditioning. And understanding our responses and the root of it, can help you in your everyday life.